Welcome to the To Be the Church podcast, where we explore what it looks like to truly be the church in today's culture.
Yeah, we do.
I'm Tyler Clarensaw. This is Andrew Murch.
Hello.
And for context, for those of you who may be newer with us, we are pastors at Northwest Gospel Church. We are a church family here in the suburbs of Portland, Oregon, just on the other side of the river in the Washington suburbs. And there's been a couple people recently who have told me that they've heard about our podcast from sources that I'd never heard of. So I was like, oh man, I wonder if we should reintroduce ourselves a little bit.
There you go.
So Andrew, you're the lead pastor here.
Yeah.
Have been for almost 11 years here in just a couple weeks.
Yep.
And I am.
Tyler, you're the executive pastor of ministries, originally hired almost 9 years ago as the music and arts guy. And then, did we ever call it creative arts for a time?
It was music and arts, and then it was just creative pastor. And then, because I just changed
creative pastor.
I think one Tuesday morning I got bored and changed my title and just changed the sign in the website and didn't tell anybody.
And there's a little bit of a insight into our church. That's how it
goes. So we have a couple questions we want to dive into today.
Ty, so just because we were talking about anniversaries coming up, your 9-year, my 11-year at the church here, I had a dream about you last week. Okay.
These stories always scare me.
So I feel like our listeners should know about this dream. Dreams are just weird, and like random things happen and like you can suddenly in a flash, like be in a different place or whatever else. Yeah. And I normally will have super weird dreams and then I'll wake up and I won't be able to remember a whole lot of it. But this one I could remember and I thought it was funny. And so I was like, dude, it may or may not be funny, so here's the background. It was last Thursday, and we recorded this podcast last week, and it's the one where we talked about the music and arts position that we're hiring. By the way, we're hiring a new music guy here. And we were having a lot of fun in that episode, and we ended with the whole thing about hiring Todd, right, and stuff like that. So I was it was that. I think it was the next night. It was Friday, and so I listened back to it. My wife was listening to it. We're kind of laughing about that whole piece. And so that night I had this dream or early the next morning. And the context is a few days earlier was my daughter's 9th birthday, Amelia. Just kidding. It was Amelia's 9th birthday. And so I have 4 daughters and they all have names. So we went she likes to go to Red Robin for her birthday, because they'll sing that song. But then of course, because she's 9, she was too embarrassed. So she didn't have them sing it. So anyway, so we were, the birthday dinner at Red Robin. And so this is 4 or 5 days later, we had done the podcast. I was laughing about it that day. And so that night I have this dream. And so I'm at Red Robin and it's my birthday. And you show up with Katie, and I think your family came too, because like my whole family was there. And of course, in the dream, it's like Red Robin was chaos because it's that in real life. And so the kids were all there and everything, but I was sitting in a booth, and then suddenly you and Katie were across from me, and it was like, oh, you made it, my birthday dinner. But it was my birthday seemingly, and you had made it for my birthday dinner. And I was like, oh, thanks, guys. And so we were just hanging out. Other stuff happens, nothing of substance that I remember in the dream. But then the next thing that I remember is like it's about time to get going, and like, Chris is rounding up the kids and more chaos is happening. And then I find out, because you guys weren't sure if you were going to be able to make it, but then you had made it to the birthday dinner, and I find out right before I leave, it's me sitting here and then just you and Katie across from me, and Katie is his wife. And so I find out that you were going to perhaps miss because Molly had a basketball game. Okay. Mm-hmm. His daughter's Molly. She plays basketball. So I find out right before I leave that like the basketball game was in Sisters, Oregon. And you had driven back from Sisters, Oregon just for my birthday dinner that night. Like you drove 3 hours to come to my Red Robin birthday dinner. And so I'm about to leave and I'm looking at you and I'm like, the game was in Sisters and you came back for my birthday? And then suddenly, cause it's a dream, I can see myself from the side and I had sunglasses on suddenly indoors at Red Robin. And then you look at me and you go, are you crying?
And you were.
And I was. And I had sunglasses on, but I was emotional because of how much it meant to me that you came all the way from Sisters for my birthday dinner. And then it's the next thing is I have sunglasses on. You're like, are you crying? And then I'm like, no, and then suddenly next scene, I'm on the side of the booth you and Katie are on, and I'm like sitting next to you, and I turn to you guys, and then you guys like put your arm around, she puts her arm around you, you put your arm around me, and I'm like, we're friends, and then I wake up, and anyway, I thought that was amazing, and one of the best dreams I've ever had.
I want Joseph to come back from the Old Testament and interpret that for us. Or maybe if you're listening to this and you have an interpretation for that dream, podcast at toBeTheChurch.com. We will read your interpretation on this podcast.
Epic dream, dude.
That's great. That's kind of weird that you talk about dreams, because this morning on the way to school, my 7-year-old asked me, Dad, why do we dream what we dream?
Oh.
She's like, my dreams are so weird. And I was like, well, what was your dream today? And she was like, well, there was this puppet and it was scary and it like turned me into a puppet. And I was like, what? And she's like, yeah, I couldn't move my arms and legs. Like I was just a puppet all of a sudden. And it turns out that before bed last night, my older daughter was telling spooky stories to her. And like, then she dreamt about it and all that. It, dude. But, wow, that's interesting. I would drive from Sisters, Oregon for your birthday, especially if it was at Red Robin. I like Red Robin.
Really? All right.
I do like Red Robin.
Great.
So,
I need to get my sunglasses. It's getting emotional in here.
The first thing we need to talk about is, and I was going to pose this as a question from a listener, but it didn't come in from a listener. But I just want to do an update on our football bet.
Oh, yeah. That's good. We shouldn't do that.
So if you go back a few episodes before the football season started,
both our teams are worse than we thought.
Both of our teams are worse than I thought. But somebody did ask me recently, like, hey, who's doing better, Andrew's guy or your guy?
Yeah.
So he doesn't follow football. You don't want to talk about that, huh?
Okay, go ahead.
No, we don't have to. We don't have to.
No, tell us the stats. We need these updates throughout the year.
All right.
Because
so we're
when George Kittle does a great comeback, I want it to be known.
We're 6 games in.
Yeah. Well, 5 games for the Niners because they had a bye.
Okay. Yeah. And he's been hurt a little bit.
He's on IR.
So
injured reserve.
He's played 4 games.
Yep.
An average of 10.7 points per game, and like the stats we're using. Like,
yep.
Fantasy stats.
Not good.
So he has 42.6 points through 4 games through 6 season games. Travis Kelce has played 6 games and is averaging 18.1 per game.
That's more than the other guy.
So I think the bet should have been that like your guy was going to get half my guy, because then it'd be close. I'd still be winning, but then it'd be close.
Okay.
So
we'll see what happens in the season.
Here we go.
You're the worst.
I know.
I don't need my sunglasses anymore.
Yeah. All right. So question that came in, and this is also a throwback to a previous episode. Here we go. Hi, loved the TBTC podcast and really enjoyed the most recent episode about Afghanistan. It's a few weeks ago. I just listened to the most recent episode, Mars Hill and the People of the PNW. So that's the one where we talked through. Yeah. There was a guy on Twitter who had said, like, based on Mars Hill and just his experience, here are 10 features of the church in the Pacific Northwest. And we kind of went through those and just talked about them. And most of them were like, yeah, we see all that. But anyway, listen to that episode and was wondering if in the near future you could do a follow-up episode that could further unpack you, Andrew, and Ben's thoughts about Mike Cosper's Christianity Today podcast that were shared toward the end of the episode. I became curious when Andrew made the comment along the lines, what does that even mean?
Yeah.
In response to Cosper's statement in one of the earlier episodes of the Mars Hill podcast, saying that we all killed Mars Hill.
Yeah.
I understand, or at least I think I do, the context of Cosper's remark being made in the sense that we as the church can crave and raise up leaders who are immensely gifted, but may not have the maturity and character developed to be in the office of pastor or elder and may be thrusted into such roles prematurely. On the other hand, at the end of the day, Christ will build his church even in the midst of our mess and brokenness. So I can also understand how saying we have the capability to put the kibosh on Christ's work is a very flawed way of thinking, and wasn't sure where Andrew was coming from. Anyways, I'd love to hear more of your thoughts on a future episode if that's possible.
That's great.
Cool.
Yeah, so that's a great question, and I think the answer is within the question a little bit. The question asker sort of answered the way I would answer. Christ will build his church in the mess and brokenness that is us, and I think one of my major, and I have caught up on the podcast. I don't think I've listened to the most recent episode, which I think just dropped maybe today or yesterday from when we're recording this. But I'm through the episode Red Sky at Morning, episode 10. I've listened all the way through that. So, and my thoughts are similar to what they were then, in the sense of I listened back to our Mars Hill, our Mars Hill one, the people of the Pacific Northwest and Mars Hill, just this last week, just to kind of refresh, and I wanted to make sure I feel passionately about this because I'm from the Northwest, pastor in the Northwest, have pastored in the Northwest for the last 16 years, and I'm planning to till I die, and it's very personal because of all the personal connections to Mars Hill. as well as the personal connections of the people who were Mars Hill Church. We have a ton of them at our church.
I think I counted 67 people that are from at our church that were at Mars Hill that I know of,
including people in leadership, people I'm very close to, others that are in training for leadership, those kind of things. And so it's like, I think my issue with the idea from the very beginning, and it's the way he ended episode 1, which was we all killed Mars Hill. I think he Agatha Christie, he like quoted a novel or something from her, and it was like the idea that who killed so and so, we all did, and it's sort of like it's the idea of this collective responsibility because we as the church did this or whatever. And I, like the question asker said, we do crave and raise up leaders that are gifted but may not have the maturity. But it's like my first contention with it is I don't think Mars Hill Church is dead. Who killed Mars Hill Church? The autopsy that's being done in that podcast is on, sometimes they've called it a movement, an organization, the ministry of a certain individual in a certain context. And they're doing an autopsy of all those things. The organization may have been dissolved. The individual, Mark, at the center of it may have moved to Arizona and not be in the Northwest anymore. But what Mars Hill was still is in terms of the people. I mean, this is the To Be the Church podcast. We're equipping the church to be the church. We talk all about the church is a people. And so I guess, and I didn't realize that the first time listening to it, that quote set with me a little bit like, I don't like that. I don't know what about that bothers me. But having listened through those 10 episodes over the last several months, it's like Mars Hill's not dead, right? There are people who got saved there. There are people who, and I mean, I'm talking about thousands and thousands of people who got saved in that context or discipled through that context or whatever else, who are still the church and are still in churches all throughout the Northwest. And it's like when we look on the surface, we go, oh yeah, something has died, and oh yeah, whatever else. But I don't know. I guess there's a rise after the fall of Mars Hill Church that all of us in the Northwest that are serving the Lord, that were impacted by that movement, are all a part of. And so I'm that's the feel I get with it, is like, it's not dead. This thing isn't dead. And another thing that's bothering me, I think, about some of the angle of it in this, and this is just why I get maybe a little, I don't know, too passionate about it or sometimes cynical about it or whatever, is that the idea in one of the recent episodes, the idea that like, where, it was the demon hunting episode. I actually wrote down a quote, the illusion of things going right and people wanting to believe, and kind of that angle, right? Many things were going right? Like in the story of Mars Hill, yeah, there were certainly a lot of, I mean, the thing keeps referring to the bodies behind the bus, and that quote from Driscoll and those kind of things. And like, yeah, like sure, people were getting hurt and those kind of things were occurring. But and I'm not trying to be dismissive of it at all. And I think you don't have to be dismissive of one thing, but it's like the broad brushstroke of like, this whole thing was like a cultish manipulative deal where this dude at the center was building his own marketing. Like, I'm not inside Driscoll's head or over those years or when it went wrong or whatever else. But it's like, I don't know. The people who, and in that very first episode, you remember it ended with like Driscoll, that quote from Driscoll. I was watching that live, I remember at the time, where he was saying, hey, I'm pivoting, and I'm going to be more of a father type role in the future rather than, the kind of like angry prophet type thing. And the Lord's called me to, preach the word and to love the church and to do these kinds of things. And then there was like a standing ovation. And it's like the way the Mars Hill podcast is recorded, there's that standing ovation. And then it's like the eerie music of like, but really there's all this stuff. And you look at that and go, those people weren't like in a cult, those people, the people who were even still in there and maybe hadn't been hurt or were on the outside or had just gotten saved or what, and like that were clapping in that moment. Like it's not, I know that this is like, it's not on them, dude. Like ultimately, like he goes sideways and does that stuff. Sure, there should have been better structure. Or there should have been maybe an elder here, or maybe this should have been noticed, or this noticed. But I just look at it and go like, I don't like the angle of we all are doing something in the church, and now we need to. It's like, dude, we're preaching through the book of Judges right now, and like. I'm preaching on Jephthah this coming week, and the Lord can draw. This is a quote from Keller's book, Judges for You. The Lord draws straight lines with crooked sticks, like all the time, and it's like there's, I don't know. I just look at that and go, yeah. So that's some of my thinking on it. I don't know if I've answered that super directly, but I don't like the angle of we all killed Mars Hill Church. I don't like the angle of let's build this idea, because there are a lot of things that with the podcast, if the podcast is building in you the fruit of like suspicion for in things, and that like you're or like a distrust of authority, right? A distrust of godly authority, or those type of things. The fruit that it is bearing in your life is it growing in you as you listen to it? And maybe you're, again, from all over the country, as you listen to it, question asker, if you are just, you saw it from a distance and you heard it and now you're hearing this and whatever else, if it is building in you, is it building in you gratitude? Is it building in you the fruit of the Spirit? Is it building in you a love for the Lord's church and a desire and a want to journey with people and to even to support and come alongside leaders with weaknesses who are on a journey? And again, I'm not saying that nothing in here is an apologetic for anything Driscoll ever did, right? I'm not playing that angle. I'm simply saying, where does it land with you now? Is this autopsy building godly wisdom in you and the fruits of righteousness, or is it building quote unquote worldly wisdom in you and fruits of division or suspicion or those kind of things? Because I just want to those are I think important things to keep in mind when it comes to that podcast.
Yeah, a few thoughts. So one of my favorite TV shows is Better Call Saul.
Yeah, me too. Yep.
Love that show. Comes out on Sunday nights when it's in season, and it comes out on Sunday nights, and then Monday morning they put out the Better Call Saul Insider podcast, which is the creators of the show, some of the actors, and they talk through why they made this decision, or they talk through like, man, this scene took 14 hours to shoot, and we had to watch the sun and keep shifting because of the sun. And it's just fascinating. So I usually watch the episode, listen to the podcast, watch the episode again, and the second time you watch the podcast with the creator's view in mind, it changes everything. And I love it. It's awesome. It's kind of like a behind the scenes look. And just a few weeks ago, Mike Cosper was on Preston Sprinkle's podcast, Theology in the Raw, which, that dude has like 900 episodes of that podcast. He comes out with like 3 times a week. It's wild. But essentially, they just talk through the podcast. Why'd you do it? Why are you doing this podcast? All this stuff. And then, I don't know if Preston Sprinkle, he's been on our podcast before talking about his books and stuff like that, but I don't know if he was playing dumb or if he was like legitimately just didn't realize this. He said that he tweeted before the recording that he didn't realize that the Mars Hill podcast was kind of polarizing. And so he said that he tweeted hey, I'm having Mike Cosper on to talk about the rise and fall of Mars Hill. He knew it was popular, but he didn't know it was polarizing. And so he's like, what question should I ask him?
Yeah.
And then in a way that only Preston Sprinkle can, he asked him the hardest questions. And he's like, so I don't even know what this question means, but 4 people sent me a question similar to the fact that the church that Mike Cosper was leader at was every bit as dysfunctional as Mars Hill. What does he have to say about that? And so he's like, so what do you have to say about that? And at one point, Cosper's like, man, you're not pulling any punches, are you?
Yeah, that's good.
And it was great. Like, it was good, but I feel like in the midst of that, like, I can now view the Mars Hill podcast as if it's Tuesday watching Better Call Saul.
Okay.
To where it's like, I can view it a little less cynical.
Yeah.
And a little more like for what it is, or for what it was intended to be, I guess I would say. And not saying in any way that that all motives are pure or anything like that. But it's been interesting to listen to that podcast since that. And I think that the thing, you're talking about what is it creating in people?
Yeah.
I think one really healthy thing it's creating in me and other folks that I've talked to is introspection.
Okay.
Like, man, like, do I have like any of the tendencies to be the, like, in any way narcissistic in my leadership?
Sure.
You know, whether it's this much or this, you know, this, you know, whether it's going to ruin a 15 church organization or whether it's going to like make 2 people leave the church. Do I have any of that?
Yeah.
And I think it's been really helpful and healthy. Another thing, I've been asking people that went to Mars Hill, what do you think of it? You know, and some of them are saying it's too raw. I can't even listen.
Yeah.
Some of them are saying, I don't think they're quite doing it justice. And a lot of them are saying, man, it's been actually pretty healing for me to like listen through the story I lived.
Yeah.
And I think that's really cool. One thing I will say, and I think this is true in church ministry in general, and I think this can be something that we can look at as church leaders and say like, okay, is this healthy here or not? Is that when I talk to people about their experience at Mars Hill, their experience at Mars Hill is pretty directly related to the health of their primary discipler.
Okay. That's cool.
So I've talked to people who were at, I think it was Bellevue. That's the one that he was at, right?
He was at Ballard for, okay. I think at the end toward the
Yeah. So anyway, I've talked to where the live preaching campus,
Yep.
And like we're serving in a community group as a community group leader underneath somebody who was right by Driscoll.
Yep.
Pretty rough experience for them. Talked to a lot of people at Mars Hill, Portland, who like had really healthy experiences because the leadership at Mars Hill, Portland seemed very healthy. And,
Sure.
You know, and kind of was able to either deflect, guard, or just be 3 hours away from and put aside some of the dysfunction that was clearly there. And so, yeah, I mean, you talked about how God like saved a lot of people and God, you did a lot of things. And I think that's a beautiful piece of the story. And like, yeah, I even thinking through it with that lens on, I'm like, oh man, like I knew of this person who was discipled by this other person who had a lot of the dysfunction, and that person has denounced the faith.
Sure.
And I know a lot of people who are stronger in their faith than they've ever been because of the work that happened at Mars Hill under this discipler. Yeah. And so, yeah, I think that as humans, we try to make things way more monolithic or binary than they ever are. Like just super black and white. And I think that there's a lot of gray there. And I was really hopeful that this podcast would hold the gray. And I think I finished some episodes and I'm like, great job. They really did. There were episodes that had me in tears, like talking about baptism stories and some of the beautiful stuff that happened there. And there's been other episodes where I'm like, wow, like they definitely swung and missed at that goal. And if that was even their goal, I don't know. But so
dude, and I was looking back through some of these notes I was taking the last episode I listened to on it, and the intro talks about that this is a story about power, fame, and spiritual trauma, problems faced across the spectrum of churches in America. And it makes me think about, circling back around to that idea of like, what are you experiencing as you listen to it? Particularly, I would say for people, I love hearing those stories about, again, even some of our people who really went through it and how they feel about it, right? And how the healing thing is a great thing, obviously, but particularly those who are like, who have had no experience of it, that like all Mars Hill ever was to them was just like this big church across the country, and Driscoll was this character that like, whoa, and they listened to some of his preaching or whatever, but then when it blew up, they kind of like, oh, okay, but there was no personal experience with it, and now they're listening to this with no experience in it personally. Like, is it building in you anger, distrust, superiority, or pride, and I just think of like Galatians chapter 6, when someone is caught in a sin, you who are spiritual should restore them. But watch out lest you yourself also fall, and it's the idea of beware you think you stand lest you fall kind of thing. And so I love what you said about introspection, but you who are spiritual should restore him, and I again, we could go into that context further, but it's like, it just speaks to the fact of the varying levels of maturity within the church, and the fact of the role that people have to play when the stuff proverbially hits the fan, which it always does. And I talked about it in that last episode too, and there was one thing I said in that episode that like I wanted to think about like how that came off, and I'm like, so that's why I listened back through it, and I was just kind of, and we're, it's To Be the Church podcast, so we're like talking out of our butts, and that should be our tagline. And so talking out of our ears, excuse me, our backsides. So the and I talked about in the recent episodes had been like kind of, making hits on the complementarian thing. And basically when you look at it from a liberal theology, a feminist angle, you're going to put complementarianism and abuse are basically synonymous, right? That's what the feminist would say, is that complementarianism and abuse, like those things go hand in hand. And for those of us who saw the complementarianism within Mars Hill and some aspects of it, the teaching of it, and then for those of us who may not teach it exactly that way or whatever else, but are in that complementarian camp, like that's a straw man. It's like that's not what complementarianism is. And I think for a lot of people at Mars Hill, that wasn't even their experience. They go, that's not at all the way that it was. And so I just think that's a, but in that last episode, I mentioned the quote unquote random feminist from across the country giving her opinion on it. And I thought back through that, and I'm like, dude, I don't want to be a jerk. Like, I want to make sure I'm not, I do believe that feminism is not the right route, particularly within the church, but I want to make sure I'm not giving offense in that, and so I thought back through that. I'm like, let me listen back through that. So we just got to be and in these things we got to be careful the way that we process them. We got to process them in community, in humility, and accountability. What is it building within you? I listened to 6 or 7 episodes. I took like 2 months off. And then just this last weekend, I was mentioning I caught up and listened to the last 3 or 4, and it was helpful for me to listen to 3 or 4 in a row, because I got done with those 3 or 4 and I was like, all right, yeah, I can see like, even when we recorded the last episode, it was like, it felt like Cosper, you had said the thing about like, it felt like Twitter might be influencing the route on this a little bit more. The last 3 or 4 episodes haven't sounded that way. Like the last 3 or 4 episodes have, there's been a ton of them that have been like, yeah, I don't know, and kind of pushing back on. But I've been thankful for, it seems to be, Sam Storms was in an episode 1 or 2 episodes ago talking about and that to me was great. The fact of the Demon Hunter one, right? And they were talking about spiritual warfare and charismatic stuff. And then they bring on Sam Storms, like the guy you'd want to bring on in those areas to speak to it in a balanced way, to speak to it that like, and all those things. But as far as it was that whole part of like, are women more susceptible to the demonic or whatever else? And Storms is like, I'm a complementarian, and that's ridiculous, So it's like, that's where I go. That's what we need. And I think earlier on, episodes 3, 4, 5 or whatever, to be able to have that balance when someone is maybe pushing it a little far, and you're like, well, that's not actually what that believes or but anyway. So
yeah, backing up just a minute, you talked about kind of what it's creating in us, and I think posture is so important. Yeah, like as we intake. Speaking of, as we as I'm hunched over, as we bring into our minds any sort of media or entertainment, and it reminded me of an article by a guy named Brad Hambrick about the podcast, where the article is called "Is the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill Failure Porn?" Is what he said.
Yeah, that's
one of the things he brought in there.
That article got a lot of play.
Yeah, it says this forces us to question. This forces us questions to ask ourselves: are we listening to be warned and educated, or are we listening to be awed and entertained? does the narrative of the series cause us to dehumanize and delight in the harm people experience, or does it cause us to see unseen hurting people and spark compassion? And I do think that The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill can do either of those.
Yeah.
And it's probably just going to bring out whatever's naturally in you, or what you're disciplined enough to let come out of you. And so,
and who is around you too. Like if you're in community, if you're in accountability, if there's spiritual authority, if you're like doing those things in a healthy church environment, the worst instincts that will pull us aside will be tempered in those environments, right? And and I mean, we look at that even with the Mars Hill story, like Mark didn't have the kind of accountability or submission to accountability, particularly in the later years, that stuff that he had said in the earlier years were his primary, like, hey, we're going to be accountable. Hey, Jesus is the lead pastor. Those kind of things started to fade away in the later years as it got bigger and bigger, apparently. So yeah, all things to keep in mind.
Yeah. And, I think that the tendency can be for those of us who are in a similar theological camp to Mars Hill can be to try to explain away or to make excuses for, or it wasn't that bad, or whatever. Yeah. And then on the opposite side of the aisle, like if this is not your theological camp, you can be a little more delightful in the problems and say, like, see, if they would just X, Y, or Z,
if they would just believe like me,
dude. And exactly. I mean, I felt this as a Christian when like you hear of a moral failure of a pastor, of somebody who just believes differently than you. It's like, yeah, I get it. But when it's somebody in your tribe, it takes some soul searching to be like, wait, why did that happen? How can that happen?
I thought we were right about everything.
I thought we had this right. You know what I mean? And that can happen. And so I think that posture is really important in there.
Dude, that's so good. That's so the case on politics too. You'll see like somebody like a recent, Colin Powell, right? Recently died of COVID. He's 84 years old, and he's, this great political leader from, years ago, and on the left and the right, really well respected guy. And it's like every side, depending on how they feel about that specific guy or how they feel about COVID, like gets into things like, see, I told you with this, or see, I told you that. And it's just, that is the way the world works, right? And so to be the church, like we don't live that way. We have a different posture, but we're in that environment in our culture, and we also have that within us with our own sin. So it's like, that's where you got to thread the needle and be in community and be in accountability and be under the Word of God. And so, yeah, that's big, man. Good.
Yeah.
Good stuff.
Well, if you have follow-up questions you have about this, or you have questions about anything, feel free, hit us up. podcast@tobethechurch.com is the best place to do that. You can do that on social media as well, @tobethechurch. And until next Friday, keep being the church.